right, welcome to topic 1.2, and in this topic we are going to be working on how to round significant figures. This builds off of the previous lesson on how do you count number of significant figures, so that is how the notes begin with just a brief review of applying our Atlantic-Pacific rule. You may want to pause the video at this time and run through these on your own just to see how things go doing this yourself. In example A, I'm going to use the Pacific rule because decimal's present. I go from left to the right, therefore there are 4 significant figures. Letter B, so going across the row here, is going to use the Atlantic rule because decimal's absent. Going from right to left, then this also will have 3 sig figs. In C, we have 0.14. It's going to use the Pacific rule. Again, as you read left to right, you start at your first non-zero. Therefore, this has 2. In letter D, we have 709.2. It's going to use the Pacific rule. So as we go from left to right, it has 4 significant figures. Letter E, we have 5,006.12. It's going to use the Pacific rule, start at the 5, go all the way to the right, and in total we then have 6 significant figures. F is also using Pacific because we have a decimal present. It's going to go left to right, starting at the 7, going all the way, and that has 2. 36.00, it's decimal present, therefore it's Pacific. We go left to right, it has 4. H is also Pacific. I really like the Pacific rule apparently. So we have 100.6040. And so we start at that 1 and then go all the way to the right. So all of those zeros are going to count along the way. And we have 7. And the last one is finally an Atlantic rule. We go right to left. We start there at this 1, go all the way to the left, and then we then have 5 total significant figures. And that's a quick review on how do we count. So, like I said, the theme for today is how to round. So every day with significant figures, we are going to build upon this and get to a deeper level of understanding of how to work with them. So again, I just have them broke up into manageable chunks, okay? So here, we're rounding all of these to 3 significant figures, okay? So when we do an initial count here, in total, this number has 4 total significant figures because, again, we start with the Atlantic rule. We go right to left. So again, there's 4 sig figs in the number. When you go to round this, we have to think about where our greatest, how do I want to word this? Place value. We keep the largest place value and make our way down. So we can keep the thousands place. This is where our first significant figure starts. We can keep the hundreds and we can keep the tens place. We cannot keep the ones place. That is going to give us a 4th significant figure. So when we go to round, we would write 8, 0, keeping the thousands and the hundreds, and we're looking at the tens place. You look at what comes after that. Well, a 6 comes after, thinking of rounding rules, that rounds that 7 up to 8. Okay? Yes, 808 has 3 significant figures. But we need to keep the 8 in the thousands place, the 0 in the hundreds, and now what rounded to a 7 in the tens place. So that 6 we eliminated, we need to then substitute with a 0. What that does is it keeps everything in the same place value. And if you go and apply the Atlantic and Pacific rule, we have now changed this to Atlantic. We read right to left, and there's only 3 sig figs. Okay, so again, you add zeros when you need to move something and keep something in a specific place value. So here, if you look at example B, this is going to be Pacific rule because decimal's present. So we start here at the 5 and go all the way to the right. So this has 4 significant figures. If we're eliminating this down to 3, again, these zeros do not count. We're only looking at places where values are being counted as significant. So we can keep the 5, the 2, and where the 0 is at. Everything else is going to go. So we have to look at, does this 8 round up the 0, which it will. These zeros, again, are placeholders, just like we added the 0 as a placeholder here. So we need to keep those, but again, they are not counting as significant figures. So then we have our 5, 2, and then the 0 that has now rounded up to a 1. And that, again, when you're done here and you do your Atlantic Pacific rule, you're going to count 3 sig figs, okay? So here in example C, same idea. This is a Pacific rule. So we start here on the left and go all the way to the right. So in total, there's 5 sig figs. We need to, again, cut this down to 3. So I can keep the 2, the 5, and the 0, the hundreds, tens, and ones place. Everything else after that is going to be eliminated. You have to decide, is this 9 going to round up? And it sure is. So then I go ahead and write my answer with rounding as 251. And again, if you apply the Atlantic rule, there are 3 sig figs, and we're done. In example 2, we have 2.097. Using the Pacific rule, this number has 4 sig figs. Looking at what we can keep the ones place, the tenths, and the hundredths. The thousandths is going to have to go. Now, what happens is the 7 is going to round that 9. Well, this is what I call the domino effect. This is then going to round up the 0. And so when I go to rewrite this, I would write 2.1. 2.1 is only 2 significant figures. I need to keep 3. So what you do is that is now a 0. So by adding that 0, you're saying to a certain degree, this is a more accurate, more precise measurement than saying just 2.1. So 2.10, using the Pacific rule, has 3 sig figs, and that's good to go. In E, if you recall, scientific notation, you cover up the base here, and we have 8.301. So when we go to count, we use the Pacific rule, and there's 4 sig figs here. We can keep the ones place, the tenths, and the hundredths. We look at what comes after, and it's a 1. So we don't need to worry about rounding. And again, we keep that 0 because we need to keep that place value. So 8.30, and then we just write in our times 10 to the -5th. Okay. In F, we have 404.3. In total, there's 4 sig figs. I can keep my hundreds place, tens, and ones. The 3, the decimal, is going to have to go, and it is not going to round my value up. Okay, so I write my answer as 404. With the Atlantic rule, that does have 3 sig figs. All right, we have 208.64. Pacific rule is going to give us, in total, 5 sig figs. We can keep the 2, the 0, and the 8. Everything else we're going to eliminate. And if you look, that 6 coming after is going to round. So our final answer, once we have rounding, is going to be 209. In H, we have 4.899. In total, with the Pacific rule, there is 4 sig figs. Okay. We can keep the ones, the tenths, and the hundredths. Looking at that thousandths place, it's going to round. And like letter D, what happens here is that 9 then rounds the 8. What we end up with initially then is 4.9. 4.9 has only 2 significant figures. We need to allow it to have 1 more sig fig. So because of this domino effect, what we end up reporting this as is 4.90, and that gives us 3 significant figures. So again, on any of these, you can go back through with the Atlantic Pacific rule and get your 3 sig figs. Okay. So here you may want to pause the video and see if you can do this, but what we're doing here is rounding to 2 sig figs. As you get fewer and fewer sig figs that you're allowed to keep, it becomes a little bit trickier, okay? So this is going to be the Atlantic rule, and this allows us to have 3. We can keep the hundreds place and the tens. The ones place is going to have to go, and we are going to have rounding here. So we get an answer of 12 to start, but that's 115 and 12 are significantly different from one another. So we had to eliminate that ones place, so we substituted in with a 0. Again, apply the Atlantic rule, it has 2 sig figs. If you put a decimal on the end, that gives you a 3rd significant figure, which we do not want. In B, we use the Pacific rule. There's 3 sig figs total. Okay, we can keep the ones place and we can keep the tenths. We round. That 9 then rounds up this 1 to 2. But we need to give it a 2nd significant figure. So we add 0.0, and that will give us 2 significant figures. In C, it's the Atlantic rule. So in total, there are 3 sig figs. We can keep here the 10,000 spot and the 1,000 spot. Everything else after it's going to be eliminated. And I'm looking for rounding, which that will round it. So we get 38 to start. What we then do is to keep these in the correct places in the value, we substitute zeros. And our answer is 38,000. Sig figs with scientific notation. Again, looking at the base, there are 3 total sig figs. We can keep the 3 and the 10th place. The 7 will have to go, and that 7 will round up. So we end up with 3.1, and that's times 10 to the 8th, and that part does not influence sig figs. E, we have 0.47322. Using the Pacific rule, we have 5 sig figs. That 0 in the front doesn't count. So I keep my 0 point. I can keep the 4 and the 7, and I do not need to worry about rounding. So 0.47, and that one's complete. In F, we have 813. Using the Atlantic rule, there are 3. We can keep the hundreds place and the tens. I look for rounding, and that 3 is not going to round up the 1. So I have 81, but I need to keep everything in the right place, so I substitute in a 0 for 810. For G, we have 55.6. This has 3 significant figures because I'm using the Pacific rule. So I can keep the 5 and the 5, the 10s and the 1s, and I look for rounding, which I will need to do. My answer is 56. Here I have 1,557,000. I'm using the Atlantic rule. With the Atlantic rule, there are 4 sig figs, and I can only keep the 1 and the 5. After that, everything's going to go, and we are going to need to round. So I'm going to replace that with rounding with a 6. All the rest of my value here needs to be replaced with zeros. So 2 zeros replacing that 5 and 7, and then those zeros that were at the end of the value that weren't significant to begin with. So this rounds to 1,600,000 to keep 2 sig figs. Okay. Here what we have is a number, and we're going to round it to a different set of sig figs. So 13.9575 is a Pacific problem, and it has a total of 6 significant figures to begin with. So to start, we only want to keep 4. So we start at our largest place value and make our way down, and that's 13.95. You have to look at what comes after. A 7 comes after, so that will round up. So this value to 3 significant figures is 13.96. Okay. In B, we're going to go to 3. So we'll start at the 1s, or the 10s, the 1s, and the hundredths. I look at what comes after, and that's a 5. So it's going to round up. Well, this is that domino effect. So we end up with 13.9 rounding up, and then that rounds up the 1. So to give this 3 significant figures, we're going to have 4.0, or 14.0, excuse me. For 2 significant figures, I can keep the 1 spot and the 10s. The whole decimal is going to go. That 9 will round up, and this is just 14 for 2 sig figs. And 1 sig fig, all we can keep then here is the 10s place. Everything else is going to go. And again, everything we need to look for is rounding before we go further. And so that 1 does not round up, so we keep the 1. But I need to keep that 3, or the place, the 1s that the 3 was in, because we need to keep the 1 in the 10 spot. So I substitute in a 0. So as we eliminate number of significant figures, that value drastically changes. All right, the last thing is we're going to put these into scientific notation, and then we're going to round to sig figs, okay? So here, my decimals here on the end, so I'm going to move it to the left. And specifically, I'm moving it to the left 3 times. So in scientific notation, this becomes 2.947. It's a positive because it's a greater than 1 value, and I moved it 3 times. I'm going to keep with scientific notation. So in B, I'm moving my decimal to the right. Those leading zeros can go away. I get 8.596 times 10, and I moved it 1, 2, 3, 4 to the right, and it's negative because it's less than 1. And in C, The big thing here is this one is different because if you apply the Atlantic and Pacific rule, there is a total of 5 significant figures in this whole number. I need to keep those 5 sig figs. So what I do is I move my decimal 1, 2, 3. So my value in scientific notation, keeping those 5 original sig figs, requires me to keep all 5 zeros, or 3 zeros to keep the 5, excuse me. So I have 6.1000 to the third. Okay. It wants us to then round these down to 3. So here I can keep all the way to the hundredths. I will round up to get 2.95, and that's going to be to the positive third. In B, I can keep all the way again to the hundredths. I am going to round and have that domino effect. So we end up with 8.60, and that was to the negative fourth. Again, that doesn't change anything with the power here. Again, we're going from 5 sig figs dropping down to 3, so I can keep, again, 2 decimal places, and no rounding, so I keep that 0, 6.10 times 10 to the third power. And this is how you round with significant figures. Please reach out if you have questions.